What happens when one woman stands her ground in the face of authority? The tension in the cabin was palpable. Eyes locked, breaths held. Elise had pushed too far. "Are you going to move?" she demanded, but Eleanor's answer was unwavering. She wasn't just another passenger, and this wasn't just a seat dispute. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. The flight attendant glided through the cabin, moving with precision, as though cutting through the thick air like a blade. "Ma'am," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I've already told you, you need to rebook to economy class, or I'll have to call security." The tension in the air was palpable. Passengers exchanged glances, some feigning indifference, others pulling out their phones, sensing this might be the moment the drama unraveled. In first class, the mood shifted, anticipation hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. At the heart of it all was a woman sitting quietly in seat C2A. She wore an elegantly tailored suit, sleek and black, the fabric hugging her frame as though it had been stitched directly onto her. There were no gaudy jewels, no loud designer labels screaming for attention. Yet, there was an undeniable presence about her, a quiet, assured confidence that made heads turn, that made people sit up straighter in their seats. When she entered a room, everything seemed to shift, to settle, around her. Her name was Eleanor Graves. But nobody on that plane knew that yet. The flight attendant, Elise Brooks, stopped in her tracks as Eleanor turned her head slowly, her gaze calm yet unyielding. She stared at the attendant, her eyes cool and impassive, before mouthing the words, "It's my seat." Elise Brooks, a woman who had built her life on professionalism, folded her arms across her chest. She knew better. She had seen this before. She was the sort of person who prided herself on keeping control, on handling situations like these with grace. But today, something was different. Something about the way she spoke, about the sharp edge to her words, made the passengers around her sit up and pay attention. It was no longer just about a seating dispute. "First class is for priority passengers," Elise said, her voice laced with a hint of judgment, a pause hanging in the air. "I don't want to embarrass you, ma'am, but I need you to move." Eleanor's response was smooth, calm, unaffected. "I paid for this seat," she said, her hand slipping into her sleek leather bag and pulling out her boarding pass. She held it up, offering it for inspection, but Elise didn't take it. In fact, she didn't even look at it. "Ma'am, I don't know how you ended up here, but this section," she paused again, the weight of her words sinking in like a final judgment, "is for another class of passengers." The air seemed to thicken further. Eleanor wasn't fazed. She had seen this before, different places, different faces, but always the same story. People who assumed they had the power to decide who belonged where, who belonged to what class. A man sitting in seat 3C, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair and a navy blazer, leaned forward, brow furrowed. His eyes flicked back and forth between the flight attendant and Eleanor, sensing something bigger was at play. The flight attendant's voice grew sharper, louder, for all to hear. "I need you to move now, or I'll have security meet us when we land." Eleanor placed the boarding pass back on the tray table and folded her hands in her lap, her gaze steady. "No," she said, her voice calm but resolute. A ripple of tension spread through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to get involved. They had seen it all before. The subtle dance of power, the quiet undercurrent of judgment, the hidden assumptions. They all recognized it now, a pattern, a story that was playing out once again. But this time, something was different. The man in seat 3C, his curiosity piqued, leaned even further forward. His eyes, sharp with a mixture of concern and intrigue, fixed on Eleanor. He wasn't the only one who could feel it. There was more to this than a simple seating issue. Much more. Eleanor, however, remained unshaken, her presence filling the space with a force that left no room for doubt. She was not the woman they thought her to be. And in that moment, as the tension grew thick in the air, the whole cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash that would reveal the true power of this unassuming woman in the seat that nobody thought she belonged in. But what none of them knew was that Eleanor Graves wasn't just any passenger. She wasn't a woman who could be easily dismissed. And soon, the world they thought they knew would shift, the truth slowly unraveling in the most unexpected of ways. The hidden clue that would break the case wide open was right there, within their reach. And Eleanor was about to reveal it. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted, thick with tension. The second flight attendant, Jessica, hovered nearby, her face a mix of concern and hesitation. Her eyes flickered between the situation unfolding and her colleague, Elise, sensing that something was about to erupt. "Elise," Jessica murmured, her voice uneasy, "maybe we should just—" "No," Elise replied, her voice tight, almost brittle. "This isn't about the ticket." The words hung in the air, charged with an unspoken truth. Jessica blanched, stepping back slightly, instinctively sensing that Elise had just stepped far beyond her depth. Eleanor, however, remained unwavering. She had dealt with this before. "Then what's it about?" she asked, her tone calm but piercing. Elise opened her mouth, then closed it. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to freeze, a silence stretching out unnaturally long. No one dared to speak. Not even the faintest breath disturbed the air. In one fluid motion, Eleanor reached into her bag, not for her phone, not for anything that could escalate the situation, but for a simple black notebook. With deliberate precision, she flipped it open, drew out a pen, and began to write. The gesture was quiet, but it held a power that made the entire cabin hold its breath. Elise blinked, momentarily caught off guard. What are you doing?" Her voice was sharp, unnerved by Eleanor's composed response. "Take notes," Eleanor replied smoothly, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. A flush spread across Elise's face, a blend of frustration and embarrassment. "Ma'am, I will have you removed from this seat." Before Eleanor could respond, a voice cut through the tension from behind. "This is preposterous." A man's voice spoke coolly, his tone steady, unaffected. It was a man in the navy blazer. He was watching the exchange with a calm, unimpressed gaze. "She's sitting in her assigned seat. We've all seen her ticket. Why is this even a conversation?" Elise's jaw clenched, her patience waning. "Sir, this is an internal matter." "Not anymore," he replied firmly. "You're making it a public one." A murmur ran through the cabin, the ripple of awareness spreading like wildfire. Eleanor said nothing. She didn't need to. With a simple click of her pen, she let her silence do the talking. Elise's fingers curled into tight fists, her knuckles turning white. But then, as if realizing the futility of this confrontation in front of an entire cabin of witnesses, she turned sharply on her heel and stormed to the front of the plane. The tension didn't leave with her. It lingered, a heavy, unseen presence that refused to fade. Eleanor watched her retreat, the weight of the moment settling in around her like a shadow, reaching across the rows of seats. She turned to Jessica, the second attendant, who stood a few feet away, her posture stiff and uncomfortable. Jessica looked apologetic, as if she knew something wasn't right but lacked the authority to do anything about it. Instead of speaking, Eleanor offered her a small, knowing nod, and then picked up her boarding pass, slipping it back into her bag. She settled back into her seat, her posture as composed as ever. But even as she sat there, she could still feel the eyes on her, the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. She knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't over. As Elise stormed down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, the tension remained thick in the air, unshakable. It seeped into every corner of the cabin, an unwanted guest making everyone hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting furtive, curious glances at Eleanor. Some quickly looked away, pretending not to notice. Eleanor didn't react. She sat still, her face unreadable, her fingers light on the armrest. She was used to this, the weight of being underestimated, of having to prove herself in rooms where she shouldn't have to. But tonight, this moment was different. Tonight, she wasn't just another passenger. She was a force to be reckoned with. Jessica hesitated a few feet away, her fingers fidgeting nervously at the edge of her uniform. She seemed like she was about to speak, but then, without a word, she turned and followed Elise to the galley, disappearing behind the shelter of the curtain. Eleanor took a slow breath, glancing sideways at her wristwatch. She had a feeling this flight was going to be much longer than expected. A soft murmur broke the silence. The man in the navy blazer leaned forward slightly, his voice low and careful. "Are you all right?" Eleanor turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her eyes briefly meeting his. "I'm fine," she said simply. He studied her for a moment, then nodded, the concern in his eyes giving way to a silent understanding. Across the aisle, a younger passenger, perhaps in his mid-20s, had pulled out his phone, raising it subtly, clearly recording the unfolding drama. Eleanor noticed, but didn't flinch. Let them document it. She had nothing to hide. The curtain at the front of the cabin slid open, and Elise reappeared. Her face was contorted with irritation, her features puckered like fruit left out in the rain. She muttered under her breath, speaking to someone out of view, though Eleanor didn't need to hear the words to understand. Elise wasn't done yet. The overhead speakers crackled to life, cutting through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, beverage service will begin shortly. Please remain seated and enjoy your flight." Elise pushed the cart down the aisle, stopping when she reached Eleanor's row. Her fingers tightened on the cart handle, her face tight with professionalism, but her voice was strained. "Water?" she asked, her words crisp, rehearsed, as though she was holding back a storm. Eleanor met her gaze, her expression calm. "Water," she said softly. Elise set the glass down with a little more force than necessary. Water splashed over the sides, but she didn't say another word as she moved away, her body language speaking volumes. Eleanor reached for the glass, steadying it with careful precision, her fingers brushing the cool surface. Her expression didn't change, but inside, she was already preparing for what came next. This was just the beginning. The real story had yet to unfold. Eleanor sat, her fingers resting lightly on the glass of water in front of her. The cool surface of the glass felt almost soothing, but the chill didn't touch the storm brewing inside her. The water began to bead with condensation, tracing slow, deliberate patterns against her skin. As the plane hummed softly through the night, the sound was a stark contrast to the tension that pulsed through the first-class cabin. Everything felt taut, like the air was waiting for something to snap. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer glanced at her once more, his expression unreadable. She could feel his scrutiny, but it didn't bother her. Then, there was the kid in the hoodie. He still had his phone out, angled just so, pretending to scroll through it. But Eleanor knew better. He was recording everything, capturing the quiet tension, the subtle power struggle unfolding. At the front of the cabin, Elise, the flight attendant, stood near the galley, her back straight, arms crossed defensively. She was whispering to another male crew member, tall, sharp-jawed, someone she thought would side with her. He nodded along, but Eleanor could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes as his gaze darted toward her. Eleanor exhaled slowly. She had encountered people like Elise before, control freaks who thrived on making others feel small, the type who thought their authority was unquestionable, their power absolute. But Eleanor knew better. Power was a strange thing. It could shift in an instant, when you least expected it. And tonight, it was her turn to hold the reins. A sudden jolt of turbulence rocked the cabin, minor but enough to make a few passengers stiffen in their seats, gripping the armrests tightly. Eleanor barely blinked. Elise seized a moment to march back down the aisle with purpose, stopping beside Eleanor's seat. "Ma'am," she said, her voice deliberately calm, though there was an edge beneath the words. "I need to ask you again. Are you going to move to the back of the plane, or do I need to escalate this?" Eleanor didn't budge, her gaze locked with Elise's, unwavering, her posture a silent statement of strength. "I'm exactly where I belong," she said, her voice smooth and certain. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The tension in the air was palpable. Elise's jaw tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. After a beat, she spoke again, her voice tinged with barely contained frustration. "Then we have a problem." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving Elise's. "Do we?" For a fleeting moment, the mask that Elise had carefully constructed cracked. Her eyes darted toward the galley, seeking backup that wasn't coming. No one was going to rush to her aid this time. Slowly, Elise straightened her shoulders and forced a tight smile, though it was more a grimace than anything else. "I'll handle this another way," she muttered, turning sharply and retreating toward the front of the plane. Eleanor watched her go, her mind already piecing together the quiet shifts that were taking place behind the scenes. Elise didn't realize it yet, but she was playing the wrong game. Eleanor was no stranger to these types of power struggles. She had seen them unfold countless times before, and this time, it was her turn to win. As Elise disappeared behind the galley curtain, the tension in the cabin hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had only thickened, settling over the passengers like a heavy, ominous storm cloud. It was no longer just a disagreement between a passenger and a flight attendant. It was a spectacle, slowly building, drawing in the attention of everyone around. No one could look away. A low murmur rippled through the rows behind Eleanor. The passengers who had been pretending not to watch were now whispering amongst themselves, exchanging theories and sharing glances. Some were recording, others simply observing, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. The man in the navy blazer leaned forward slightly, his voice low and careful. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked, his concern evident in his eyes. Eleanor didn't turn her head. "I'm fine," she replied simply. He hesitated for a moment, then gave a slow nod, as if to reassure himself. "All right then," he said, and fell silent again. Eleanor's attention was momentarily drawn to a young passenger in his mid-20s, casually dressed in a hoodie, who had raised his phone, clearly recording the exchange. Eleanor noticed, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't worried. Let them document it. She had nothing to hide. The curtain at the front of the cabin slid open once more, and Elise reappeared. Her face was tight with frustration, her smile long gone, replaced by something sharper. She muttered something under her breath, though Eleanor couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. The message was clear. Elise wasn't finished yet. The overhead speakers crackled to life, cutting through the heavy silence. Elise's voice came through, strained but still trying to maintain an air of civility. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to remind everybody that for their own safety, all passengers are required to comply with crew instructions. Failure to do so may result in further action upon landing. We appreciate your cooperation." Eleanor allowed herself the smallest of smiles, a barely perceptible curve of her lips. It was a subtle acknowledgement, not of victory, but of the quiet defiance she had just planted. Elise was still trying to regain control, but she was losing ground, and she didn't even realize it yet. A flight attendant emerged from the galley, but it wasn't Elise. It was the male crew member Eleanor had seen earlier, the one Elise had been speaking to. His name was Lucas, and his expression was tense as he approached Eleanor's seat. "Ma'am," he began carefully, his tone neutral, "I just want to confirm. This is your assigned seat, correct?" Eleanor reached into her bag, pulled out her boarding pass, and handed it to him without a word. He examined it, exhaled through his nose, and muttered, "That's all I needed," before handing it back to her. Without another glance at Elise, he turned and walked back toward the galley, his body language speaking volumes. Elise's head snapped toward him as he passed, her expression a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed anger. The exchange between them was brief, but it was enough to show that Lucas wasn't interested in backing her up. He wasn't going to be her ally in this fight. Eleanor let out a quiet breath. Elise was losing ground, and the flight still had hours left in the air. The tension in the cabin had become a living, breathing thing, no longer just an uncomfortable confrontation between one passenger and a flight attendant. It was something bigger, a spectacle that no one could escape. Eleanor straightened the cuff of her jacket, her fingers cool against the smooth fabric. She wasn't nervous, and she wasn't angry. She was just waiting. Patience was often the finest tool in moments like these, and Eleanor knew how to wield it. Elise stood near the galley now, her back to the cabin, speaking in furious whispers with another crew member. Her frustration was palpable, her shoulders tense, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She knew that the control she thought she had was slipping, and it was slipping fast. Lucas had positioned himself near the beverage cart, deliberately avoiding any further confrontation. He wasn't getting involved, and he wasn't backing Elise up. Jessica, the younger flight attendant, hovered nearby, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her fingers tightened nervously on the edge of the drink tray she carried. She looked like she wanted to speak up, but she didn't. Then, Elise turned back toward the cabin. Her forced smile was gone, replaced by a brittle professionalism that cracked under the weight of the situation. She had lost this battle, but the war was just beginning. Elise's gaze was colder now, sharper, as she moved with intent through the cabin. The tension was palpable, like the air before a storm. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. Her eyes fixated on Eleanor's seat, as if that's where her battle would be won or lost. "Ma'am," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the plane, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Since you refuse to comply with crew instructions, we'll be addressing the situation upon landing." A murmur rippled through the cabin, passengers exchanging uneasy glances. Eleanor, however, barely flinched. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her calm demeanor never wavering. "Which instructions exactly?" she asked, her voice smooth, deliberate, as though inviting Elise to make her next move. For a moment, silence enveloped them both, thick and heavy. Elise's lips parted, but the words seemed to die on her tongue. The quiet stretched just long enough for it to feel like an accusation in itself. Then, Elise straightened her back, trying to reclaim control. "You've disrupted the service and refused to cooperate when asked to move," she snapped, her words not just a statement, but a challenge. Jessica, the younger flight attendant, flinched. She knew the truth, knew Eleanor hadn't done anything wrong. But Eleanor didn't argue. Instead, she reached for a bag, pulled out her phone, and placed it face up on the tray table. The screen glowed as the camera began recording. "If there's a problem," Eleanor said, her tone as calm as ever, "I'd like to document exactly how it's being handled." The tension in the cabin thickened. Elise's face turned pale as her eyes darted nervously around. The man in the navy blazer, who had been silently observing, let out a quiet hum of approval. The young man in the hoodie across the aisle, who had been pretending to scroll through his phone, now lifted it higher, openly recording. A few other passengers shifted in their seats, curiosity piquing their discomfort. Elise's composure wavered for just a fraction of a second before she straightened her shoulders again, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're free to record, ma'am," she said through gritted teeth, "but it doesn't change the fact that you're causing a disruption." Before Eleanor could respond, a new voice entered the conversation, one that cut through the tension like a blade. "I'd like to know the answer to that, too." The entire cabin stilled as the captain stepped into the aisle. Tall and broad, his crisp uniform and unreadable expression commanded instant authority. His presence shifted the balance of power in the room. Elise opened her mouth, but no words came out. The captain's gaze flicked between her and Eleanor, his eyes sharp, assessing. "I was informed there was a situation," he said, his tone calm but laced with an unspoken firmness. "What's the issue here?" Elise, clearly caught off guard, swallowed hard before stammering. "This passenger, she's been refusing to comply with instructions." The captain turned to Eleanor, his voice professional, but underneath it, there was a thread of patience, as though he was already prepared for what he might hear. "Ma'am, is that true?" Eleanor didn't flinch. She met his gaze with quiet confidence. "No, Captain," she said. "I was seated here, and I have stayed seated. I've done nothing that is not standard and expected of a passenger. The only issue has been my treatment while doing so." The captain nodded, turning his attention to Elise. Was her boarding pass checked? Lucas, the male flight attendant who had been standing near the galley, stepped forward, his voice steady. "Yes, I checked it myself. It's valid." Elise shot him a glare, but Lucas remained unmoved. The captain's eyebrow arched, and he turned back to Elise. "Then that's all." Elise's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. The captain's gaze lingered on her for a moment, sharp and piercing, before he addressed the cabin once more. "You've made a mistake," he said bluntly, his voice carrying an air of finality, "and I'll be addressing it." The silence that followed felt like a weight pressing down on everyone in the cabin. The passengers, who had been avoiding eye contact just moments before, now exchanged looks of disbelief and quiet relief. Elise stood frozen, her face flushed with the humiliation she couldn't hide. The captain, however, turned back to Eleanor, offering a small nod of apology. "My apologies for the inconvenience, ma'am. Please, enjoy the rest of your flight." Eleanor inclined her head in return, her voice calm and measured. "Thank you, Captain." She watched him as he walked back toward the cockpit, leaving behind a cabin full of passengers who now, for the first time, seemed unsure of which side to fall on. Elise remained frozen, her face stiff, her body language betraying the crushing blow to her authority. The shift was delicate, undeniable. Whatever control she thought she had over the situation had vanished, and it wasn't Eleanor who had taken it from her. It was Elise herself. Jessica, the younger flight attendant, hesitated before stepping closer to Eleanor's seat. Her eyes flicked nervously, filled with uncertainty, but also a deeper sense of guilt. "Ma'am," she said softly, I'm sorry about all of this." Eleanor met her gaze, her eyes steady and kind. "You spoke up when it mattered," she said, her tone calm but firm. "That's more than most do." Jessica swallowed, her expression shifting with silent relief. She nodded quickly and returned to her duties. The hum of the cabin gradually returned to normal, though the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. Hours passed, and Elise did not return to the cabin for some time. When she finally did, her face was carefully neutral, her body language rigid. She avoided looking in Eleanor's direction altogether. The passengers had settled, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were quieter, movements more restrained. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something else, unsure of what side they should take. The young man across the aisle, who had lowered his phone, exchanged a knowing smirk with the man in the navy blazer, whose arms were now crossed, coolly regarding Elise. Eleanor glanced at her watch. A few more hours to go. She had won the battle, but she knew this was far from over. Jessica passed by with the beverage cart, stopping briefly beside Eleanor's seat. Her voice was softer now, touched by a gentleness that hadn't been there before. "Anything else for you, ma'am?" Eleanor smiled, her tone warm but composed. "I'm fine, thank you." Jessica nodded and moved down the aisle, her posture a little less tense, a little more sure of herself. Elise stood near the galley, arms folded tightly across her chest, waiting, as though calculating her next move. But everyone knew the balance of power had already shifted. It wasn't a battle that needed to be fought any longer. Eleanor had already won. As the plane began its descent, Eleanor gazed out the window, her thoughts a quiet storm. She wasn't a woman driven by revenge, No. Her belief lay in consequences, and Elise had just ensured hers were coming. The silence in the cabin was thick, like the tension that still hung in the air. Conversations had died down to mere whispers, but the hum of the engines and the stillness in the air made every breath feel louder than it should. It wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Eleanor's fingers lightly tapped against the armrest, her mind sharp but steady. She wasn't impatient. She knew how these situations played out. People like Elise didn't back down. They just waited for another opportunity. Her back straightened as Jessica passed her row. A quiet exchange between them. "Just a heads up. We'll be collecting trash soon," Jessica whispered. Eleanor nodded but didn't speak. Her calm demeanor an unspoken answer. The tension in the air seemed to ripple, passing between the passengers like a silent, shared understanding. Up ahead, Elise remained near the galley, her face composed, but Eleanor could read the tension in her body. She was waiting for the next move, but Eleanor was prepared. She had long anticipated this moment. It was almost time. As the plane descended, the cabin lights dimmed, signaling the end of the flight. But Eleanor knew the real descent hadn't begun yet. It would start the moment they landed. The focus wasn't on the runway, but on what awaited when they reached the gate. Elise hadn't spoken since the incident, her posture rigid, eyes fixed on some distant point. Avoidance wouldn't save her now. The intercom clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts and secure your personal belongings for landing." The passengers shifted in their seats, preparing for what felt like the inevitable. But the real anticipation was about to begin. Elise stood motionless near the galley, and the air felt thick with the weight of what was coming. When the plane touched down, the sense of release was almost palpable. But the atmosphere hadn't lightened, not yet. Eleanor's movements were deliberate as she fastened her seatbelt and adjusted her jacket, her body poised like a coiled spring. Across the aisle, the man in the navy blazer shifted forward, his eyes following Elise as she passed, but he said nothing. His subtle nod to Eleanor was all she needed. The game had changed, and Elise was losing. The plane came to a complete stop, and the intercom crackled once more. "Please remain seated while we approach the gate. There will be a slight delay as airport personnel board the aircraft." A murmur of confusion spread through the cabin, and Eleanor remained calm. She knew exactly what was happening. She had prepared for this moment. As the officers stepped on the plane, Elise's face paled. She was no longer in control. The two uniformed officers stood at the front of the plane, their expressions unreadable. Elise's grip tightened on the galley counter, her knuckles white. Her eyes scanned the passengers, now acutely aware of the weight of every gaze on her. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Brooks, you need to come with us." The silence that followed was deafening. The young man in the hoodie raised his phone, the quiet click of a recording starting again. Elise opened her mouth, but no words came out. The officers remained silent, waiting for her to comply. "This is ridiculous," Elise muttered, barely audible. The officer's response was steady, final. "Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Eleanor sat unmoving, eyes locked on Elise. She didn't need to speak. Her gaze was enough. After a beat, Elise finally stepped away from the galley, her movements slow, reluctant. She walked down the aisle, her head high but her eyes flickering nervously toward Eleanor, the other passengers, and the phones that were documenting every moment. As she passed Eleanor's seat, their eyes met for just a second. Elise's face twisted with something, frustration, bitterness. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched. And then, without a word, Elise continued down the aisle, her body language betraying her. She knew it was over. The moment the cabin door opened, the tension that had built up for so long snapped. A murmur spread through the cabin, the passengers exchanging glances, some reaching for their phones. Jessica, still shaken, grasped the drink cart for support, her eyes finding Eleanor's. There was relief in her gaze, but also guilt, as though she wished she had done more sooner. The man in the navy blazer leaned back in his seat, shaking his head slightly, muttering under his breath, "Well, that was something." A quiet applause began near the back of the cabin, hesitant at first, then growing in strength, small, subtle, but unmistakable. Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't react, but she felt it. She had just won something far bigger than a seat on a plane. As she adjusted the strap of her bag and stood, she felt the weight of the change in the air. The eyes of the passengers were on her, but it wasn't just about the looks. It was the silent recognition that something had shifted. As she walked down the aisle, she felt the world outside the plane call her. She had held her ground, and now she was walking away with something no one could take from her. For the first time that evening, she glanced back. And there, in the midst of the hum of murmurs, she caught sight of Elise. Her head was lowered, her eyes fixed on the ground.